One of the most common questions I get asked on both my channel and the HackMotion YouTube channel is, does it work for the driver? Essentially what's being asked is, are the wrist angles with an iron the same as with a driver? Today's video is going to answer that question and hopefully dispel some common myths out there that might be holding you back from hitting this club as well as you should be. So shortly I'll be hitting shots wearing the HackMotion wrist sensor with both an iron and the driver to show you how similar or different the wrist angles might be. But before I do that, I just want to dispel a couple of bad myths that are out there in the golfing world about how maybe the driver differs from the iron and what might be holding you back. If we switch to this front camera view now and just take a look at how a lot of people interpret the way you hit the driver versus the way you hit the iron, I think most people would generally understand the idea that an iron is supposed to be struck where you hit slightly down on the ball, and a driver is more or less level to the ground or even slightly up. And I would tend to agree with that, but the way in which you hit up is very important to understand. The fact is, most golfers misinterpret how to hit up on the ball, believing that in order to hit up on the ball, you need to have the shaft of the driver leaning back so that the head is past the hands and traveling in an upward direction. And that's just not true. In fact, hitting the driver in that fashion with the lead wrist moving into extension prematurely actually results in a loss of distance and often encourages you to slice the golf ball. So I want you to understand that you can actually hit the driver with an upward angle of attack, but still have a small amount of shaft lean like you would do with an iron shot. However, the way that you do this requires your body to move in a way that it maybe isn't doing just right now. And this movement is necessary in the driver more than any other club. The reason that is because the driver is a faster swing than an iron swing. So any movements that your body has to make need to be amplified and increased if we're going to sustain the necessary wrist angles that we want with the driver. The piece of the swing that I'm referring to specifically is that you need to have more of a hip sway, a movement of the lower body towards the target by the time you reach impact, in order to create the desirable shoulder tilt that's necessary at impact to keep the wrist alignments in place. So if I move my hips towards the target sufficiently, and again I've already mentioned this happens more with the driver than any other club, if I manage to move my hips forward, I create the desired shoulder tilt, my wrist angles can stay intact. Conversely, what so many people do, just because they don't realize, number one, you need to make this movement, or number two, how much of this movement you need to make, particularly with the driver. Well, most golfers aren't into that position where their lower body hasn't moved forward sufficiently. They don't have the necessary tilt in place with their body at impact. And as a result, their wrists have to break down, their arms start to bend, and they start to look like this through the ball. That's the wrist angles breaking down, not because they're supposed to be different with the driver, but because the body motion with the driver for that golfer just isn't sufficient enough to maintain the desirable wrist angles. So I'm going to share with you a drill now that you can do without a club to start with, just learning the correct body motion that's necessary with the driver to be able to help you maintain those more desirable wrist angles through impact. So in order to do this drill, you're just going to need a door frame within your house that you can use as some sort of barrier for the side of your head. I've set up this training station here to mimic what I would do in a lesson environment, and I build training stations like this all the time to help my students create boundaries and constraints for them to conform to and train them to move their body in a different way. This specific drill is going to keep your head stationary or keep your head stable by virtue of the fact that you're going to have the door frame positioned just a few centimeters away from your lead ear, my left ear. I'm using the rod here as my door frame. And then I can take my regular golf setup without a club for now and just practice moving the lower body, pushing the hips forward and the arms pushing into the follow through, to train that hip slide that I was describing, which builds in this shoulder tilt that we need in order to keep the arm and wrist structure stable through the ball. You'll see this demonstrated by good ball strikers. Great golfers do this all the time. They move their lower body forwards while keeping their upper body stable. Another thing to point out at this time is that we don't create the tilt for the driver by moving the upper body backwards like this. That is such a common myth that's demonstrated by so many golfers, and it absolutely kills your ability to hit the driver. The tilt that we're looking for is created by moving the lower body forwards, not by moving the upper body back. Very important distinction between the way you create the tilt. So use the door frame, no club to begin with, just begin to train the feeling of moving the hips to the left or towards the target. Keep moving them towards the target while keeping the head stable. That's the movement that you need to make with all clubs, and that's the movement you need to make more with the driver, because the driver swing is longer and it's faster. So if you're deficient in this movement in the rest of your swing, which a lot of people are, it's really just going to be magnified with the driver if you don't have enough of it. And then you can progress with this drill to using a stick, an alignment stick on the ground. I like to do this exercise because the sensation of dragging the stick along the ground while still conforming to the head on the wall or the door frame exercise that I've already shared with you starts to combine and train the movement of the body along with good arm and wrist structure through impact. Meaning I'm not getting this stick to come through the target to the target here by pulling my arms up or flexing my wrists. I'm requiring my body to slide and start to extend, which is the movement backwards of the spine through the ball, in order to elevate this stick away from the ground. It's a very simple movement, particularly when you've practiced it a lot. But if you aren't familiar with it, you may find it a little difficult to begin with, which is why I like to start by getting you to do this with a stick before we introduce the club. Once you become fairly proficient at that and think you have a sense of it, we can keep the constraints in place and go ahead and hit the ball. Quick question for you. Did you know that 80% of your golf ball's direction comes from the club face angle at impact? And it's your wrists that control that angle. If you want to hit straighter shots and add more distance to your game, then check out the link in the description below. Standard 7-iron shot there, slight overdraw on my part, but reasonable contact, and you'll see from the HackMotion wrist sensor, we have some somewhat consistent pattern with the wrist angles. Namely, from this front view, I can show you that the wrist started in a small amount of extension. It's 10 degrees of extension, as we discussed previously. When I hit the ball, there was 11 degrees of flexion. So there's a 20-degree movement towards flexion. Most of you would be familiar with that. That's what's supposed to happen with an iron, I think. Most of you understand that we should have some shaft lean with a good iron shot, or good alignments for an iron shot at impact. And in order to do that, as I say, we do need to flex the wrist slightly. Something you may not be so familiar with is that those wrist alignments, those wrist movements are similar and consistent with the driver if your body motion allows you to do that. So let me now go ahead and hit a driver, and we'll compare that to the iron. Wasn't my best strike, little bit of a heel strike and a slight overdraw. I'll have another go at one of those before I finish, but I want to show you there how the wrist angles through that shot were somewhat similar to what we were getting with the iron. We started in exactly the same amount of extension at setup. If you remember, it was 10 degrees. So I still have 10 degrees of extension when I started my swing. And when I made contact with that driver, I had 7 degrees of flex. So there's a 17-degree twist. It's effectively the same amount. So I'm adding in that shaft lean the same way that I did with the iron. I'm twisting the shaft in exactly the same way to allow me to deliver a little bit more shaft lean at impact, because I move my body in a way that allows me to do so. So if you're struggling to get the numbers on your wrist angles to be correct with the driver, it isn't because the wrist angle numbers are supposed to be different. It's because your body isn't moving in a way that allows you to keep the good wrist angles you might have with your iron and transfer that into the driver. Slightly better contact, still turned it over a little bit too much. Beginning to get the right sort of shape on the ball, I'm drawing it. And again, the numbers are relatively consistent with what I would want to look for. The extension at setup, and then more flexed at impact. One more of those before I finish, because I need to make sure I get one out of the center for you to show you what's possible. But the value of this video is to try and communicate to you the fact that the wrist angles really are not supposed to change too much between the iron and the driver. They're much more similar than they are different, as long as the body motion of your swing allows you to keep the wrist angles that we're looking for. That one came a little bit more out the middle. Finally, push draw down the center, 275 yards. The wrist angles on the HackMotion, again, a little bit of extension at setup. There's 12 degrees of extension, and moving to flexion at impact, got 5 degrees there. We hit the greens just before we finished. So hopefully this video serves as somewhat of an education for you as far as explaining that the iron and wrist angles, the iron and driver wrist angles are not so different at all. That although you do hit up on one and down on the other, the wrist angles don't really need to change. What needs to change, or needs to be sufficient, is the slide of the hips and the body motion that we need to create that side bend through impact. I hope you found the video useful, and if you're looking for further videos to train your wrist angles using HackMotion, then please click on the link down below.